welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We are back virtually. We were actually physically in each other's presence just a few days ago in the Nashville area in Lebanon at the Fight Laugh Feast Network Conference. And by the way, that was great. If we met you there or talked to you there, we are really glad we had that opportunity to do that. And I hope you agree with us that it was just a marvelous event. Anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I am a pastor. I serve a church here in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Portland. I've written some books. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've done some real estate investing. I've even been a contractor doing home improvement and construction. Anyway, that's enough about me. Why don't we go to you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, and I have my own 501c3 called Every Square Inch Ministries that I also run. I've done a lot of different things like Chris, but all of mine fall in the egghead category.
Well, we got to have eggheads in the world. Anyway, Tom.
Did
Tom
you
hear me,
Price.
Tom?
I teach systematic. Yeah, you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a variety of other things. I've done plenty of things in life. I won't list all of them here, but I do play guitar. I did my undergrad in that, so that has definitely enhanced my vision of the world a little bit. And I teach these things at a variety of places. So that's enough about me at this moment.
Yeah, in fact, you're going to have the show today, Tom. But before we jump into that, I wanted to say something about our Pacific Northwest tour. Now that we're past the Fight Laugh Feast conference, we can talk about that. Anyway, if you live in the Pacific Northwest, or if you are really wealthy and you want to fly to the Pacific Northwest just to see us, you can do that. And we're going to be in 3 locations. We're going to be in the Portland, Oregon area, probably on the Washington side of the Columbia River. And then we're going to be up in Seattle. And then we're going to be going to Moscow, Idaho. So kind of a L right there in the Pacific Northwest. We're going to be in the Portland area on October 30th and 31st. And we will let you know a little more about the venues as things come together. But that is where we'll be during those dates, the 30th and 31st in the Portland, Oregon area. Then we're going to be up in the Seattle area on the second. It could be the first, second, and third, or just the second and third. We're not entirely clear yet how that's all going to work out. But we're going to be in the Seattle area on those days. So it'd be Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, the first, second, and third of November. We'll be in Seattle. And then we'll be going to Moscow, and we'll be in Moscow the 4th, 5th, and that'll be it. We'll be there for 2 days, the 4th and 5th. That's Thursday and Friday of that week in November. So that's what's going on with that. We're going to be getting a page up on our website with the information when we have it all worked out, sort of all the details, venues, and so forth, and times. So if you are in the area, please, or in the Pacific Northwest, please at least put on your calendar at this point where we'll be and when. Portland, Seattle, and Moscow in October and November. All right, enough of that. Why don't we? There's one more thing I wanted to say. We have been talking about merchandise. Everybody has a T-shirt, and so do we. Isn't that beautiful? It's so hideous. It's beautiful. That's us. Our heads on a pug. And so it's a 3-headed Cerberus pug. And man, we had people freaking out when they saw that. And it was like a cult classic. It's like, one of those just really awful things like Revenge of the Killer Tomatoes or something. Anyway, enough of that. So, Tom, you told us about what we're going to be talking about today, and it's going to be a fun conversation. We got a little bit of a delay with you, Tom, when you talk. So we'll do our best to try to maybe wave at you to give you an idea when we're ready to talk, and then you can kind of, so we're not stepping on each other as we interact. But anyway, take it away.
Okay. So hopefully that delay is not too bad. So today what I wanted to do is I want to talk about a book in particular. This book is by the author Paul Tyson. Paul has written a variety of books on themes of, I think, metaphysics and classical visions of transcendence, and really the full Christian vision that is behind someone like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien in their approach to setting forth what they think are the best and deepest insights of that rich Christian understanding of things. And this book is a little bit different for him in that it's dealing with it from the angle of magic. So the title of the book is 7 Brief Lessons on Magic. Now, before everyone starts freaking out and thinking we've really gone occult, he's kind of utilizing the term magic here, maybe in a way akin to the way Tolkien was understanding that ability to harness certain kinds of meanings and forces that Tolkien used in a deep connection with technology, or thinking of it in a way similar to Charles Williams, who was another inkling friend of Lewis and the rest, who really spent a little more time on focusing on that. But I guess just to start with, he's not really using the term so differently than the term enchantment. Magic and enchantment are pretty much, he's actually taking the German word that Weber used to talk about disenchantment and calling it basically magic, right? Or demagicizing when we take away from the enchanted world. But one of the things that's interesting about the book is, first, it's the setting that he's trying to work these ideas out of. And he is first looking at it from that kind of flat view of reality that modern scientism has given us, in which there is something basically that is reducible to a mechanistic view of nature. This is something we've talked about a lot on this show. We talked a little bit about it this weekend. And so what he wants to do is talk about the way in which the truth lens is his term, I think, here, from which modern science looks at things. It can see certain things, and those things it sees pretty well. But there's a lot of things that it cannot see. And so the term magic here is a way of talking about, this is his way of putting it, the shimmering cosmic meanings and the dangerous and life-giving powers that are just below the surface of the apparent. In other words, there's more going on to reality than that which, for example, a natural reductionistic scientific view can give. This is something we've talked about over and over again on this show. But we haven't really talked about it from this sense of using the term magic and all that resonates. But so the first part of the book is really setting up how the scientific world as we've received it, how it's really flattened our view of reality, but it hasn't gotten away from the magical. It has it's kind of replaced it. And he spends a lot of time talking about the way in which technology is infused with all of these harnessing of powers and realities that raise the question of magic. But then he also notes the fascination with the fantastical and even the fascination with Tolkien, with Harry Potter, and all these different kinds of visions that don't really find a proper setting within the naturalistic vision of things. And so that's a context in which he's talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Tom, it reminds me a little bit of a book that your introduction reminds me of a book that a fellow named Jaron Lanier wrote entitled "You Are Not a Gadget," a manifesto. This is an odd book in the sense that Lanier is actually a techie. He's kind of a veteran of Silicon Valley, and he makes the distinction between qualitative and quantitative. Basically, machines and essentially this, science as it's practiced are, focused on the quantitative, being able to measure things and thereby create a kind of mathematical correspondence between the physical world and the world of math. That's where we, see physicists do all of their work, and that's all great. But there's no qualitative, really, possibilities or sort of recognition, or you can't translate the qualitative into the numerical. These are two different modes, and you can talk about math being beautiful, and you can make that kind of statement, which is qualitative in nature, and but you can't do the reverse. You can't take the qualitative and reduce it to the quant. And he was addressing essentially the challenge of artificial intelligence. His point is that artificial intelligence will never move from the quantitative into the qualitative, which eliminates the possibility of consciousness, the sort of the singularity and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Now, where I would go with this is, a couple places. This brings me right back to the word ramble on enchantment that I did a while ago. But one of the other ways of thinking about it is using Francis Schaeffer's idea of upper and lower story thinking, or the fact-value distinction, to use a more technical term. The idea here is that the upper story of the world is the world of values, it's the world of faith, it's the world of aesthetics, all of those kinds of things. The lower story is the empirical world. And to someone in scientism, the lower story is the only world that exists.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is that there are attempts to invade the upper story from the lower story. So love, for example, is defined as hormones. It's just simply literally chemistry. It's a chemical response. They try to come up with rules for aesthetics so that they can mathematize the ideas of beauty and things like that, and just try to find a purely material explanation for all of these things. So the lower story can kind of attack the upper story. You can't use the upper story to explain the lower story, though. That's verboten. Yeah. So that's the traditional way it works. And what it seems to me this is doing is it's suggesting a middle ground between the two.
Yeah.
So that you have an area that is carved out that participates in both the upper and the lower story, in a sense. So it's a middle between the two.
And I think his way of framing it'll make a little more sense when I kind of sum up the four, what he calls the four kind of views of magic that really don't have many alternatives. And one of the things that's a little tricky here, and I'm trying to constantly communicate this, and this is very hard to do, but the very notion of a two-tiered universe is itself a byproduct of movements away from classical views of transcendence. That's why the true Christianity, when it carved out its view of transcendence, had more affinity with the Platonic view because it didn't suffer from that which develops out of a distortion of it, this notion of supernature versus nature, fact, value. Because what happens, these things, as we will see, create a distortion of the view of eternity and time, and the creaturely and the creator, and the transcendent and the immanent. And by doing that, they create all the problems we have with this modern setting. They create the whole conditions for the naturalistic vision. But let me step into that, because this is where a lot of the questions I have people asking me continue to rise. So the first thing he notes is, he says magic's concerned, as we talked about, with cosmic meanings and then dangerous and life-giving powers below the surface of the apparent. He goes, but there are kind of four basic theories about magic. And the first one he talks about, which he thinks will actually make a return to those that don't want to go the direction of a classic Christian vision or something Platonic, will be what he calls the animistic theory of magic. In this view, basically holds that magic is entirely located immanently within nature, and nature itself is divine. So it's divine. So it's kind of a pantheistic view where everything is kind of bursting forth with forces and energies and wills, their own powers and intentions. And so therefore, there's something very magical about it. So we too, in this theory, even human beings are both natural and magical. They're a part of this whole. And this would be similar to, I don't know, we've talked about Charles Taylor's work, but this would be the unbuffered self, if you will, the porous self, open to all of these different forces that the Enlightenment buffer came to kind of to build some distance up between us. Let me animated, of course.
Let me just quickly just note there that when people hear about sort of the I guess the prospect of re-enchantment, this is kind of where they go in kind of this animistic thinking, and I think it's important for us to make it clear that we're not thinking that. But I think another thing it would also be good to note here is that even if you wanted to go there, if you wanted to be, say, a druid or some kind of a animist, with a way of thinking about the natural world that's akin to how maybe Native Americans think or thought, or people from Africa or whatever. Well, what these folks fail to appreciate is that when you genuinely are submerged in this sort of spiritual world where things are unbuffered, you're vulnerable and you're fearful.
Yeah.
This is not a way to experience sort of the kind of warm fuzzies that you have when you read Sword and Sorcery or fantasy, or, as a kid. This is a way of life in which you're afraid of witches and being hexed. You're afraid of people manipulating you through sort of spiritual forces, and so you're constantly on your guard because you're unbuffered. You can be invaded at any moment and harmed and influenced. So if we could just help New Agey type people just get that into their heads, into their thick skulls, they would not long for the kind of thing that they seem to be longing for.
And I don't want to trace this trail too long, but I think sometimes the extreme sides of the charismatic movement continue some of this in Christianity. They're seeing the devil in one, the letters of one's bowl of soup kind of stuff. There is this way in which this understanding has kind of continued on through certain views of Christianity that have not weaned off of something that is in conflict with its larger reality vision.
Yeah, an concrete example of the problems here in practical terms is when I was in Mongolia, I was interviewing shamans and I was interviewing what I would describe as victims of shamans. And what happens is a shaman will approach a young person and basically tell them, your ancestral spirits are calling you to become a shaman, so you need to come train with me, and it's going to cost you this amount of money to do it. And if the person refuses, no, I'm not going to do that, the shaman will tell them, well, if you don't do this, the spirits are going to start killing off members of your family one at a time until you agree. it's sort of the ultimate in mafioso tactics.
Yeah.
To get them to sign on to the program. And then when they go through their initiation, they get their training, they do their initiation. There are all kinds of, I talked to one of them who was talking about how, and she said this is really kind of typical, they move into this altered state of consciousness where they can do things physically that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise, like scale a tree in 2 or 3 steps, and they're at the top of the tree, things like this. And she says that this particular shaman told me that they always invite in a white spirit and a black spirit, because white and black spirits do things and some different things. And sometimes you can invite in other color spirits and so on. They're inviting possession.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think another thing that related to this is that when Christianity entered into a world and worlds as it moved out of Judea and entered to uttermost parts of the world, it confronted a lot of this, and the notion of Christ as victor and Lord now of all things really weaned a lot of the world off of this kind of stuff. This kind of vision was defanged, if you will, and again, it may linger in places even where Christianity has made an impact, but it has tended to be in places where that larger reality vision hasn't set forth. And one can even see that the kind of the intense disenchanting process of the West is a perversion of the original liberation that came with Christianity. It's a severing it off from the Christian, biblical vision at that point. It's kind of, the Enlightenment could be seen as a certain kind of iconoclasm, destroying anything that it looks like it's infused with any of this kind of enchantment. And so, but the second group, which is he's going to call the Platonic theory of magic, and I understand why he's using that. I think I would have labeled it the classic vision of transcendence. And it has a variety of forms. You have the Platonic, you have the Aristotelian wedded to the Platonic. Then you have the Christian that kind of takes what is consistent in those with the biblical vision and then guts out the stuff that aren't. So we could lump all that. But in short, he puts it very well. He says, this theory, in this ancient theory, magic, though saturating nature, has its origin from beyond nature. To this theory, the world that we can touch and see is derivative. It's not primary, it's derivative. In Christian language, it depends on God. That's what being a creature is, endlessly dependent on the source of all things. So it's derived from and dependent on a transcendental, immaterial reality. Without this higher reality, the ever-changing, observable world, the visible, in which we live would be a field of incomprehensible flux and contingency. So we can see meaning and order and value in nature because nature itself is dependent on the intrinsic meaning of the eternal order and the primal goodness of divine reason. To this second theory, there is a transcendent and intellective beyond that orders and sustains the natural world into what we're born into. And so what he's trying to do is show that there is inherent meaning and order, but it's not grounded in nature. It's grounded in nature's genuine participation in the gift of being that has been donated to it from the transcendent. This is the creation ex nihilo, really, I think, points out more than any of the other visions the way in which this is radically contingent. So this is here. But then what happens is there becomes a development. And this is where things get confusing, even in the church, because a lot of times, unfortunately, I don't think we think anymore from the classic transcendental vision. We think of this changed vision. And this is a place where basically by around the 14th century, what started to develop is a deep interest in the self-standing and concrete whatness of created things. In other words, created natural things started to be looked at not merely as participating for their being and what they are in a higher transcendental order, but started to become interesting in their own right, as if they were self-standing, as if they had a pure nature that did not derive from or depend on anything else. This is where we start to see the first fruits of a two-tier level of reality. You have the spiritual, and then you have a nature that is self-standing. The fact realm doesn't need the spiritual or other realm in order to be made sense of or to understand it. Now, when we think of today, for example, Van Tillian presuppositionalism, what we think of them attacking when they talk about autonomous man or reason, that would never have made sense on the prior view. But it would make sense in this view, because this view thinks that you can have a pure human nature that can be autonomous from the transcendent and therefore somehow go its own way. And so the attempt to move from here to the transcendent is again, a violation of orders at this point. It's tempting to do something it can't do. Flip it. The supernatural now becomes a problem for the natural. Because if the natural is self-standing, what is there for the supernatural to do? Well, at first it can provide values, but eventually that gets severed. And then we throw out, God of the gaps. Once God's no longer needed to explain anything, you can throw the supernatural order out, and then you land with the natural. So this notion of basically is what is called pure nature. And it was really big in something being fought during the 16th century. And sadly, I think a lot of the Reformation ran with it in its assumptions. I think the scholastic figures tried to slow it down. They saw this starting to develop. I mean, you can read all the way up a bit later with Turretin and other figures who had not succumbed to it. But by and large, almost anything written in probably the last 200 years is already immersed in this pure nature verse, maybe even longer. So anyway, you have this, in this case, the super. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the kind of an important transition. Was it the 14th century that you noted? Was that the time you were thinking about?
Yeah, well, that's what Tyson puts it, and we've talked about it before, where the shifts in views of God and the nominalism start to come in, and I think that's what starts to give the particular its kind of significance. I know it's coupled with complicated things like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to kind of go back and revisit a little bit for our listeners, because I think sometimes we lose. It's kind of the history of the development of theology, and fail to appreciate that some of the heresies and wrong turns actually occurred in theology first, and found their way into other places. And when we fail to recognize those wrong turns or those heretical ideas in Christian theology itself, we can more or less assume that we can kind of live with the modern sort of way of doing theology without having to go back and address what went wrong. So, like when you think about nominalism, that's a thing that's complicated, and I know that Glenn has helped us to see that it's not all bad, and I agree, it's not all bad. If we didn't have some kind of nominalist term, we probably wouldn't have experimental science like we have today. But at the same time, it's worth noting that this isn't just like a bunch of atheists who thought up a kind of a Trojan horse to kind of sneak into Christianity. This is something that developed within the Christian, sort of theological tradition that actually got exported into the larger culture.
That's right. One way of putting it, and I think Tyson will put it this way, is the new atheism is really the byproduct of this theological error that developed, that did not hold in place things. And again, I'm not going down the line that there was ever a perfect synthesis that held everything in a perfect balance, that there's a golden theological moment. But there is one that had really carved out a genuine, distinct Christian view of transcendence that owed itself completely to the biblical vision, and a metaphysics of creation that was not autonomous, has always been understood as being absolutely originated, continued in existence, and dependent for what it is and what it's to become on the infinite source of what it is. But what ends up happening is, and I don't want to retrace all that history, but you do have a shift from a full vision of God and God's unified attributes, where when God does something, God's will and intelligibility are connected, to one where God's will starts to become so emphasized that anything God does in the world, because God is so radically free, even free from his own intelligibility, that God just arbitrarily chooses things. And so it's about the imposition of a will rather than a will that expresses the full character of God. And when that shifts, we start to see everything else, because it doesn't have an inherent intelligibility grounded in God and oriented to God. Now its intelligibility is genuinely there, but it's arbitrary. And so begins to be made. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now we all know that if Glenn controlled the Terminator, he would go back in time and kill Rousseau, right? Well, I've played with this idea a little bit myself, and I would have taken the Terminator further back to the great Franciscan Dominican debates in the period of time that we're talking about here. And I think I would have sent him after maybe, I don't know, William of Ockham, maybe John Duns Scotus, one of those guys. I was working on an idea for a short story on this for a while, and in my short story, I had a monk, some maybe of a new order, maybe in the order of Leibowitz, if you remember Chronicles, the Chronicle, the Canticle of Leibowitz, that great science fiction. That great science fiction story where maybe a monk in the 24th century goes back to the 14th century to take out William of Ockham of John Duns Scotus, and then can't, because there are angels actually protecting these Franciscan monks, and he's unable to actually get the job done, because in God's good order, there's a providential ordering of things, and those guys were necessary to serve God's purposes, in the grand scheme of things, even though many regrettable things have happened as a result of their work. But anyway, that's my twist. That's my take on
it. I want to just tip the hat to some of the things that Occam did that were worthwhile. He's the first person who articulated a clear theory that property is a human right. An unalienable right, in fact.
Maybe that's why we want to go after. Maybe that's why we want to have to better go after Scotus. Maybe.
and I don't.
We should probably do a show on nominalism at some point.
Yeah, and really getting into the deep consequences of it. But one of the things he also then, after he talks about this he calls that the supernatural view of magic, and he contrasts again with classical views of transcendence. This is oftentimes used in the theological literature as well, especially if you're reading it today, is they do understand that this supernatural view has a strong affinity to the naturalist view. And this is one of the things Tyson actually says. He said, this is why your William Craigs and your Alvin Plantinga can be what he calls modern orthodox. They fit right in with the naturalistic vision. And he said, and so he would say that, and this is very hard because a lot of our evangelical apologists have been educated in that kind of tradition, supernatural versus natural. And so they're always looking for these points of unity. And they oftentimes are talking about things that someone from the ancient church wouldn't have even made sense to. They'd be probably horrified that we ever went into that territory. It's not questioning their orthodoxy. He's just saying that it is one indebted to this alternative metaphysic that is a changed view of transcendence in its relation to nature. And it's one that would affirm in many cases a pure nature.
Yeah, I think that we need to be careful when we use analytic philosophy. And both Craig and Plantinga are analytic guys. a lot of people in the evangelical world misattribute, or misuse the term classical apologetics and apply it to those guys because they talk about reason, but they're talking about reason in a different way than we're talking about here. Tyson is talking about the great tradition and the way Christians in the past understood a vital connection between, human reason as it's exercised properly and the logos of God, meaning, of course, second person of the Trinity. So the kind of thing that what we're referring to when we talk about classical apologetics is not William Lane Craig. It's not Plantinga. It's something. Well, it's something like, Irenaeus. that sort of person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, Tom, what the fourth view is, because I'm missing one big one that's historically significant.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to read it real quick. Though I do want to add one qualification. Again, I don't want to say that those figures don't have anything to say or never engage aspects of the Christian classical view. I mean, they do arguments, existence of God, and things like that. It's just they do it in a mode that would be more akin to the supernatural view of magic here. Now for him, so maybe you'll qualify this, because this last one sort of is the what he says. I can't even think of a better way of putting it. And he goes, this is a bad way of putting it. He calls it the anti-magical theory of magic, and that's where the supernatural theory ends up going. And it's basically a new theory about the nature of nature arose out of this supernatural theory. If nature does not need supernature to be what it is, and if nature can be understood in a purely natural way, then supernatural becomes functionally superfluous to our knowledge of the world. And so we can disregard kind of the supernatural and the magical and the metaphysical as something outside, extrinsic to true knowledge and tangible reality. And so he goes, it is now possible to think that religion, magic, and transcendence concern philosophy as mere fictions. And this leads to what he calls basically the naturalistic view. And he says there's still magic going on here, but it's all been placed within the immanent frame, but the immanent frame can't contain it. So that's where he sort of ends up.
Yeah. Now I'm going to offer a fifth view of magic, just for the record. This is what I would describe as the historic view of magic. If you go to what I would describe really as the golden age of magic theory in the Renaissance, there are two types of magic. You've got natural magic, which makes use of occult, that is Latin for hidden, forces that God placed within the universe. And if you are one of the wise, you know how to manipulate those forces to get the results that you want. In other words, magic is a kind of occult physics. Yeah, that's natural magic. That's viewed as generally okay, but the question is, how did you get your knowledge of how it worked? That might have come from demonic sources, in which case you've got to avoid it. The other version is artificial magic, which is magic that is performed by basically demonic agency. It's distinguished from miracle because miracle is performed by divine agency, or through angels or saints or something like that. Magic is different. That's how magic differs from miracle in this sense. But artificial magic is basically demonic magic. And the question here ultimately ends up being, where does the power that drives magic come from? That's the key question. Natural magic, it's God-given. It's part of the natural order, although one that's hidden from us by normal processes. The other, it's got a supernatural agency involved. Now, it's worth noting that to the medievals, things like quenching steel when you're forging it qualified as magic, because the quality of the thing that you are working with changed. It was a kind of transmutation. The same thing even applied to things like fermentation, bread rising with yeast. All of those kinds of things were versions of natural magic in this vision of the world.
Glenn, you would know more about this, obviously, than me. When we think about spirits, meaning, alcoholic drinks, is there something of this at work in when we see this transformation sort of are they did maybe people at one time think that there really were spiritual forces that were somehow moving into the liquids?
I don't think so. That's something I'd have to check into. But our use of the word spirits, I mean, it can mean anything from, hard liquor to turpentine.
Right.
So I think that there's a secondary meaning of the word spirit that's at work there that is probably only distantly connected to the primary meaning. But I'd have to check.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So, anyway, maybe we can revisit that at some time.
Well, and I think that was, I think, a weakness of the book, especially when you're dealing with magic. To his credit, he did hint at some of that when he really talks about until we really have our minds able to immerse themselves in more of a magical world, we'll be able to start picking up an antenna for realities that this narrowed down lens can't apprehend. This doesn't mean a pure opening up to subjectivity and naivety. It's just talking about the way that, because there is more to reality, being able to refine our language and concepts and our antenna for that is important. He gets into Lewis a bit with that. And then he does make the connection that I think Tolkien does, is that there is something of magic in the old sense Glenn's talking about that gets converted into technology on its more negative side. But he did not flesh that out. And it would be interesting to see the way that what Glenn's talking about would exhibit itself in the animist tradition versus the what he defines as the kind of Platonic or the supernatural vision. Because in the last version, that the supernatural, where there's a conflict, it becomes almost something silly, right? There's these outside things invading, or this, because we know now there's pure nature and nature can explain all that. But in a world that is filled with a richer hierarchy of realities, things like that may not have gone away. They just may be off our radar.
Yeah, one of the things that I was introduced to concerning magic back when I was studying cultural anthropology is a distinction that is current in cultural anthropology between religion and magic. In this distinction, magic is understood to be manipulative in character. In other words, a kind of power that allows you to control people or circumstances or material things. And religion is understood to be the submission of a worshiper to a larger order. So, in other words, magic is me imposing my will upon things, and genuine religion is submitting to the will of God or gods or something like that.
Yeah. That's interesting you mention that, because he addresses that directly, and it's probably better just to read his reply, because one of the things he does is he breaks down some different ways in which we use the term meaning magic. He goes, thirdly, though this gives the term magic a meaning that I'm not completely comfortable with, magic has a sort of social meaning connected with power in a manner that is usually contrasted with religion. Here, at least schematically, religion entails submission of one's life to a higher power, but magic entails a manipulation of the minds and lives of others for one's own ends. Without getting into interesting arguments about whether or how one can differentiate magic from religion, clearly a magician is a figure of power. Further, the magician's instrumental powers come from arcane yet fundamental knowledge. If one sort of magic is the magician's casting of illusions and the use of subtle power to manipulate and control both nature and the lives of others, then our age of commercially and governmentally applied information and communication technologies situates itself right in this kind of magic. So he kind of nods his head off, nods at least, not his head off, but in the direction of that use of magic and power. That imagery was
that's right.
Was well, maybe related to magic.
Yeah, maybe some magicians want to take your head off, right? I think related to this, though, is something that we should kind of hold on to a little bit as we think this whole thing through, and it's this whole matter of knowledge, arcane knowledge, how this relates to sort of, knowledge as power. This brings up, the provenance of science that C.S. Lewis addresses in The Abolition of Man, where he said that when it comes to the origins of science, it's coming out of a dark period in the history of the West. And this is what Glenn, I think, was referring to earlier when he was referring to sort of the history of magic, and particularly fascination with it in the early Renaissance. So there's the alchemists, these people who are seeking to control, manipulate, often through deception, often through illusion. I mean, illusions, deceptions. This is dark power. When we're talking about illusion, deception, the father of lies, and so forth. So it's mental games. Even your example earlier, Glenn, of the shaman who was on the make. She or he, if I can't remember the sex, was recruiting people to be members of, or to be I guess, acolytes or disciples, at the cost of maybe losing family members. But then, if you want to sort of progress in your knowledge of these things, you need to pay up. There's a kind of a Joel Osteen kind of effect.
Yeah, there's another thing that's kind of worth noting, just kind of going back to what you were talking about with manipulation and things like that. One of the things that's almost universal is that if you are using magic to control others, it's black magic.
Yeah.
And you can make a good argument that a lot of the things that are going on today are the equivalent of black magic.
Yeah. See, that was Tyson's point. And then he also coupled it with there's also still what we could call good magic today. He goes, we live in an age of good magic as well, not just the government and manipulative through technology, but the positive wonders of our power over nature, particularly medical science, has realized healing and public health in measures totally unattainable in previous ages. And it is from harnessing these good forces and meanings that are genuinely a part of the reality. And so his point is that we haven't, this anti-magic magic, if you will, has just really cut itself off from a fuller way of understanding this stuff, but not from there being the actual practice of good and bad magic. And I think that's one of the things he wants to retrieve. Is his point is things that show up in all of our lives, like we were talking about, being, consciousness, beauty, friendship, love, that can't be reduced to I mean, when they become reduced, they become absurd. But when you actually have a fuller vision of things, they start to not become absurd, but become placed in a way that their reality is not only genuine and real, but they make sense of our whole existence in fundamentally wider and fuller ways that fulfill our natures rather than leave us with these fragmented aspects of reality that don't cohere.
Yeah, and related to that, when we think about good magic, and if we think good magic would be medicine, well, with medicine, you clearly have the fruit of the, biological sciences and chemical sciences, but there's still the will to heal, and this is not a scientifically sort of derived phenomenon. We don't have a chemical that we can categorize as the will to heal. In other words, there's something about goodness and creativity. When we think about medicines that actually are efficacious and do good things for us, antibiotics and so forth, there's a kind of leveraging of natural phenomena, but there's a telos that's at work. We know what health looks like, or we have a pretty good idea of what health looks like, and we're trying to leverage natural forces in favor of health. We're not just, in other words, this is not pure science. This is not just figuring out how things work or why things are going, the way they're going. Yeah. Even terms like illness, and wrong or bad applied to the human body are not, something that we derive from the scientific method. We're bringing those values and those those good character or good thoughts to the science and using the science in a good way. And so that's where we could say kind of a white magic in the scientific world is occurring. Now, obviously, there are unintended consequences. Like collateral damage, maybe like from something like chemotherapy. We're kind of crude in certain ways that we go about this, but we're trying to refine the things that we do so that the healthy outcomes are what that we're looking for are what do occur, and we try to mitigate the costs in terms of ill effects.
Well, and that really ties to that fuller range of meaning. Why be concerned with health and healing, right? If just survival utility and very practical utility is the chief and highest aim of everything. I mean, I can understand why to be healthy to survive in certain kinds of ways, but it's the richer web of meaning tied to living that is a part of that. And that's where the richer the social worlds and the communicative worlds beyond just merely the physical become really pointers to this larger dimension of reality that is answered by I think in particular by the Christian view of transcendence. And then it's interesting because he's kind of talking about the way in which imagination, our imaginative power and our lyrical powers begin to not just be distractions, but actually are maybe very much a part of our natural way of participating in and working with these higher realities that are there. And I think Lewis, of course, and Tolkien were on to this. I mean, you had it with MacDonald and Owen Barfield and some of those different figures. I mean, they really were trying to get a hold of that. But I think it's a very interesting work. I think it's probably the best entrance work for people who want to look at these questions from a neat angle of magic and enchantment. It isn't trying to be a theological work, although it has import for theology. And I would qualify certain things here in different ways. But I do think he kind of gives us a lot to think about with this work.
Yeah, I especially I just read the summary article you sent around. I especially liked the connection that he draws between magic and meaning.
Yeah.
That magic is something that transcends the merely physical, the merely chemical, the merely, biological, whatever, the merely scientific, to provide things like meaning, values, to provide morality, to provide issues of free will, all of these kinds of things that cannot really be explained purely by biological functions in us.
Yeah,
and I thought that was a very, very interesting way of approaching it. That again, frankly, ties back to a lot of the things we've talked about before, and to the stuff I do on enchantment.
Yeah. I'd like to do
that. I thought was particularly valuable.
Yeah, I'd like to think a little bit about the, I guess, etymology of the word magic. I believe that the Magi, the wise men who came to, pay homage to Christ, the term Magi is related to magic, magician, so forth. So there we have in the scripture three magicians, you could say, who are viewed in a positive light. Now, I'm probably doing violence to the origin of the word here, but that's an association that I made.
No, you're not. No, you are not. Our word magic comes from magus, a Zoroastrian priest.
Yeah.
And in Rome, the word magic, or the association here, was twofold. On the one hand, you have it in the sense of the ability to harness into some form of supernatural forces, whatever, to do something. But you also had it in the sense of the word charlatan.
Oh, got it.
So there was really a complex use of the word based on how you perceived these guys coming from Persia, the ancient enemy of Rome.
Right. Yeah, this is the old story of the Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
But it is interesting in the biblical story of Christ and his birth and the early years that this shows up there, and you hear you have stargazers, right, reading the stars at night, and they end up coming to pay homage and getting the special revelation that this is the one to which all this stuff points.
And whether you like it or not, they're doing something that definitely qualifies as astrology.
Yes, that's right. And,
yep.
and
there's an interesting, I think it's a troparion for the incarnation or something like that in Eastern Orthodox Church, where it talks about how God used a star to bring the star worshiping people to worship the one true star who is the light of the world, or something like that. It's actually a rather neat prayer.
Well, and you see there that richer web of meaning that Orthodox draw upon that is very foreign to those of us that have been influenced so much by pure nature. That this makes sense. And again, this isn't an affirmation of once you know Christ, therefore going back to the shadow and making that everything. What it's saying, though, is that the creation points towards its I mean, we come at a different way. We've talked about this before in the way in which, the visible manifests the invisible attributes of God, as Romans tells us, that they're clearly seen. And of course, we suppress this knowledge. So creation, we don't have access to pure creature because pure nature is mediated to us through being, but then we don't have access to being itself because it's mediated to us through creation. And so that's the big puzzle. And that's really where Glenn's talking about that mediating position. We don't have pure nature because there is no pure nature. Nature comes participating in the source of being, but we don't have access to God through nature because being becomes mediated through nature. And so this is where you can talk either of a sacramental worldview or one in which sacrament is possible or means of grace. How? Because what ends up happening is, of course, we suppress this knowledge. It's not getting through that mediation. But when Christ comes and he brings these things back into a proper relation to the transcendent in its deepest sense, bread and wine now become those means of mediating that transcendent truth through that creaturely vehicle, which, if seen properly, is seeing the significance of Christ and Christ's work and being at the heart of all material reality as well. And so there are rich things going on here that we don't get if we just flatten this stuff out.
Right. Yeah, I think that's actually one of the major flaws within the evangelical world, in that we've participated or adopted so much of modernity that we don't really understand how a physical object can convey spiritual grace.
Yeah. Right.
And the net result is a complete ignoring of the sacraments. You show up at church and it's like, oh, it's the first Sunday of the month. We got communion. We're going to be getting out late.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't you hate that? Don't you hate
absolutely that? No sense. There's absolutely no sense that that there is something really remarkable going on here, and that these physical objects do have greater significance than just a little piece of bread and a little drink of, typically grape juice in an evangelical church.
Yeah, thanks to the Methodists. Yeah. But I think, we talked about this earlier in our show on mystery, the mysterion being the Greek that's translated to the Latinized, term, we say it use in English, sacramentum. Yeah. So we have this, when we speak of the sacraments, we're already kind of one step away from the original Greek word, of course. But the original Greek word, as we noted in our earlier episode, mysterion, refers to something hidden in something else. By its very nature, that means that you can't measure this thing, you can't quantify it, but there is a value present, and that's not placed in the thing by your faith. It's present just in the nature of things, but it's hidden. It's not entirely evident. We can say that's the way the incarnation was. It wasn't as though everyone who walked up to Christ saw that he was the Son of God, and recognized him as such, but he was. Mysteriously he was.
That's right.
Anyway, so we should probably bring this plane for a landing. By the way, I met the guy that I think made that meme, and he's actually a pilot, a commercial pilot, and so he knows what he's doing when he. Anyway, I could say more about him, but I probably shouldn't, because he's had a fascinating life and he's done some fascinating things. But anyway, let's land this baby. Anything you want to say as we conclude, Glenn, and then I'll go to you, Tom.
I'm done.
Okay. Anything else, Tom?
No. I thought this was an interesting work to springboard some of the things we've talked about before. So if you're a regular of the show, maybe none of this was fully new, but I had a lot of people asking about some of these themes that we covered at different points, but never really tied together. And I thought this work kind of did it. And this will allow kind of some of the new things that are coming down the pike to not have to say, go listen to episode 400 ago. We also retrieved it and dealt with it again more recently.
Yeah, good stuff. Anyway, we really do appreciate your interest in the Theology Pugcast. We hope you can join us for our Pacific Northwest tour. We appreciate the financial gifts that folks send along to us. We don't spend any time, twisting people's arms or talking about we're about to go out of business or anything. We're able to pay the bills because, God has prompted people to give. You can give to the Theology Pugcast through the Fight Laugh Feast Network. That's a great way to do it. We like those guys a lot. You can go to our website, the theologypugcast.com, I believe is the correct address, and you can give that way. You can give to us through Anchor Podcast, and people do all of those things, and we're really very, very grateful. And people also rate the show. They've given us 5 stars. I think we're up over 500, not 500, 200 on iTunes.
Wow.
And I know that's not even the place where most people listen to us. I think most people listen to us in other locations, but I think that on Spotify, you can rate us. Some people listen to us there. You can, as I noted, go to iTunes and rate us there. If there's some platform that you're on that I don't know about that you can give us a good rating, please do so. We're told by the people in the know that it helps. Anyway, that's, I guess, it for now. We appreciate you again. Once again, I said that before, but we really mean it, so it bears repeating. And bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye now.